In a luxurious family gathering inside a millionaire mansion, a mistress decides to humiliate the heir's wife in front of all the guests, certain that no one will have the courage to confront her. In a few seconds, a spilled wine glass turns into a scandal that exposes betrayal, pride, and years of silence within a powerful family. While the husband tries to protect the mistress and control the narrative, an unexpected detail begins to turn the game against them. But everything changes completely when the father-in-law appears and reveals a secret capable of destroying appearances and showing who the true owner of that mansion is. Before finding out how this public humiliation ended up turning into an unforgettable twist, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel and activate notifications so you don't miss any more surprising stories like this one. The Vasconcelos mansion stood atop a discreet hill in Morumbi, hidden behind ivy-covered walls and wrought-iron gates that few had the honor to cross. On that Saturday night, however, the gates were wide open, and the cars lined up at the entrance told a silent story of power, money, and prestige accumulated over decades. It was the annual Vasconcelos family dinner, a tradition that had been repeated for 40 years, always on the same weekend in October, always with the same calculated pomp to impress those coming from outside and remind those who already knew the house who, after all, was in charge there. Renata Vasconcelos arrived early, as always. She arrived early because she was the one who supervised the floral arrangements, confirmed the places at the table with the event staff, checked if the crystal glasses were polished, and if the buffet had been set up exactly as her father-in-law preferred. She had been doing this for 11 years, since she married Rodrigo Vasconcelos at 26, when she still believed that house could become a real home. She wore an off-white dress with subtle embroidery on the sleeves, her hair tied in an elegant low bun, and carried in her gaze that trained serenity of someone who has learned to hide a lot behind a serene expression. Rodrigo arrived 40 minutes after her. Without warning, without explanation, he entered through the side corridor with a loosened tie and slightly disheveled hair, and greeted the first guests with that ease of someone who never had to strive to be accepted. He was handsome, well-presented, the only son of Edmundo Vasconcelos, the patriarch who built an empire in the civil construction sector with his own hands. Rodrigo had inherited the name, the posture, and the talent for appearing exactly as people wanted to see him. What lay beneath that was another story. Renata observed him from afar, from the corner where she was finalizing a conversation with Donna Cecilia, her father-in-law's elderly cousin, who always arrived among the first and always stayed until the end. She noticed the way he greeted the guests, slightly rushed as if he were waiting for someone to arrive. And when that someone arrived, Renata felt her stomach tighten in a way she already knew well. Isadora Montero entered through the main hall as if she were the hostess. She wore a fitted red dress, her hair loose in perfect waves, and smiled with that confidence of someone who knows they are being watched and wants even more looks. She was 32 years old, a financial consultant hired by the Vasconcelos company 2 years ago, and for a long time she had ceased to be just a professional in that story. Rodrigo went to meet her far too naturally, as if it were normal, as if being beside his mistress during the family dinner was just one more logistical detail to be managed. Renata did not move from her spot. She held the glass of water with both hands and took a deep breath. Donna Cecilia, by her side, placed her hand on her arm gently. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The hall filled up over the next 30 minutes. Cousins, uncles, Edmundo's old partners, some senior employees of the company, 2 or 3 local politicians who cultivated friendship with the family for mutual convenience. The ambient music maintained a tone of calculated sophistication, and the waiters circulated with trays of appetizers and glasses of sparkling wine with the precision of those who had rehearsed every step. It was a beautiful night. It was exactly the type of night that Renata knew how to organize like no one else, and it was exactly the type of night that Rodrigo used to make her disappear. While he led Isadora from group to group, presenting her as the company's strategic consultant, as if that were sufficient explanation for the intimacy everyone could feel between the two, Renata circulated alone. She greeted people with kindness, answered questions about the children with short and precise phrases, accepted compliments about the organization of the event with a smile that did not reach her eyes. There was a tacit pact in that family. No one spoke about what was too obvious to be ignored. It was Gustavo, Rodrigo's second cousin, who broke the first silence. He approached Renata near the cold cuts table with a glass of whiskey in his hand and a gaze too direct to be casual. Gustavo was 38 years old, worked outside the family business, and had never cultivated the convenient diplomacy of the other relatives. He was the type of man who said what he thought because he could afford not to need anything from anyone there. He said quietly, "Are you okay?" Renata replied that she was, with the same smile as always. He said, "I asked for real." She looked at him for a second longer than she intended. Then she looked away toward the hall and replied that she was managing. He nodded, as if that were the most honest answer he could expect in that environment, and stayed by her side for a few more minutes without saying anything else. That silence was the kindest gesture anyone had offered her that night, until then. On the other side of the hall, Isadora laughed loudly at something Rodrigo had said. The laughter echoed slightly above the music, and some guests looked in their direction with that discreet discomfort of those who notice but prefer not to register it. Renata turned her back to the scene. When the guests were invited to take their places at the table, she occupied the chair she always occupied, to the right of the place reserved for Edmundo at the head. Rodrigo sat 2 places below her, with Isadora strategically positioned right after, close enough to maintain a constant flow of attention between the two. It was an assertion, a silent declaration made inside his own family's house, in the presence of his closest relatives, as if Renata's opinion on the matter did not even deserve to be considered. Dinner began with a cold asparagus soup. Edmundo had not yet arrived, which was unusual. Someone commented that he was resolving a last-minute matter in the upstairs office and would be down shortly. Renata noticed that Rodrigo seemed slightly relieved by his father's absence. And it was precisely at that moment, when the table's attention was distributed between side conversations and the soft sound of cutlery, that Isadora stood up to get another glass of wine from the sideboard and passed by Renata's chair in a way that left no doubt she was doing it on purpose. The glass of red wine tipped over the off-white dress with the precision of someone who had calculated the angle. The red liquid ran down the embroidered fabric like a slow and irreversible wound. The noise of the glass falling made the entire table turn their faces. Isadora stood still for a second, looking at the damage with an expression that was almost satisfaction poorly disguised as surprise, and then opened her mouth to say it had been an accident. The entire hall fell silent. Renata did not stand up immediately. She remained seated, looking at the stained dress, with that calm that only exists on the other side of a limit that has already been crossed many times before. And in that heavy silence, while everyone waited to see what would happen, she felt something break inside her, not with a crash, with the quietude of someone who finally stops holding on. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it was enough for every person at the table to record that image with precision. Renata seated, the white dress stained with red wine, and Isadora standing beside her with a smile that had not yet decided if it needed to truly apologize. The scene had the quality of things that cannot be undone, the kind of moment that an entire room recognizes as a turning point, even if they don't yet know toward where. It was Rodrigo who stood up first. He walked to the place where Renata was with that expression she knew well, the expression of someone who is about to manage a situation, not resolve it. He leaned in slightly and said, in a low voice, but not low enough so that those closest wouldn't hear, that she should stand up and go compose herself before the embarrassment worsened. As if the embarrassment were hers, as if the issue there were the stained dress and not the hand that had stained it. Renata raised her face to him. She looked into her husband's eyes for a long and transparent moment, and then said with a voice that did not tremble, "It was intentional." The whole table heard. Some guests moved in their chairs, others lowered their eyes to their plates. Isadora let out a short laugh, one of those that try to turn an accusation into exaggeration, and said it had just been a slip, that the dress could be washed, that Renata was exaggerating as always. The word always carried extra weight. It was the type of word that only works when there is a story behind it, a narrative built little by little to make a person seem unstable before they need to defend themselves. Rodrigo agreed with Isadora. He said it had been an accident, and that Renata needed to stop creating unnecessary scenes. He said this in front of everyone, with the authority of someone who is used to having the last word, and then placed his hand lightly on his wife's elbow, as if he were helping when in fact he was directing. She stood up because her legs carried her, not because he ordered it. And as the two left through the side corridor toward the upper floor, she felt the gazes on the back of her neck, like physical pressure. Donna Cecilia was the first to move at the table. She stood up with the slowness worthy of her 73 years, asked for leave from the people beside her, and walked toward the corridor without haste, without explanation. She was a woman of few words and precise gestures, and when she decided that something deserved her attention, no one dared to question. Gustavo, on the other hand, stayed at the table. He stayed because he was observing Isadora, who had returned to her place with a lightness that was irritating, as if the episode were already closed and filed away. He looked at her for a moment, then looked at the other guests who pretended to resume conversations, and felt a physical discomfort with that collective normalization. He had known Renata for 11 years. He had seen the silent transformation that the marriage had operated on her, the gradual erasing of a woman who once had an opinion on everything, and who had learned to have an opinion on nothing that mattered inside that house. In the second-floor corridor, away from view, Rodrigo spoke non-stop. He said the situation was out of control because of her, that she had embarrassed the family by making an unnecessary public accusation, that Isadora was an important business partner, and that Renata needed to understand that the world did not revolve around her insecurities. Every sentence was constructed to place the problem on her. It was a technique he had perfected over years, the art of turning the argument inside out, until the victim began to question their own perception. Renata heard everything standing up, leaning against the corridor wall, with her arms crossed over the stained dress. There was something different about her at that moment, something that Rodrigo did not notice immediately, because he was too busy with his own speech. She was not defending herself. She was not explaining herself. She was just listening, with that specific attention of someone who is listening for the last time. Isadora appeared in the corridor a few minutes later. She said she had come up to check if Renata needed help changing her clothes, and the mockery was so close to the surface it barely needed to be deciphered. She said there was a spare dress in the guest room wardrobe, that she herself could help choose it, that it was the least she could do, given the inconvenience she had caused. She used the word inconvenience, not accident. Inconvenience. As if the problem were logistical. It was then that Renata spoke for the first time since they had left the hall. She said with a clarity that left no room for interpretation, that she was not going to change her clothes, that she was not going to return to the table pretending that nothing had happened, and that she was not going to apologize for absolutely anything, because she had done nothing that required an apology. Rodrigo stood still for a second. Then he said she was being ridiculous. Then he said the guests were waiting. Then he said her father would find out how she had behaved, which was a meaningless threat, because Renata's father had passed away years before. But it served as a thermometer of the lack of real ammunition he had at that moment. Donna Cecilia arrived in the corridor at that exact instant. She stopped at the entrance, looked at the three of them with that serenity that came from age and lack of patience for theater, and then walked directly to Renata, ignoring Rodrigo and Isadora as if they were walls. She placed her hand on her daughter-in-law's face, looked into her eyes, and asked if she was okay. Renata replied that she was. Donna Cecilia said, "For real?" Renata replied that she was understanding a lot of things with great clarity at that moment. The old lady turned her face to Rodrigo then and looked at him with an expression that carried decades of family memory. She said, without raising her voice, that what had happened in the hall had been intentional, and that everyone there knew it, including him. She said there was a difference between what a family chooses to see and what it actually perceives, and that tonight it was becoming increasingly difficult to pretend the two things were the same. Rodrigo tried to respond, but Isadora touched his arm lightly, the type of gesture that says, "Wait, I'll handle this." She turned to Donna Cecilia with a smile that intended to be disarming, and said the situation had been very misinterpreted, that she and Rodrigo had a strictly professional relationship, and that Renata had exaggerated due to personal insecurities that had nothing to do with what had happened in the hall. Donna Cecilia heard her until the end. Then she just said, "I'm 73 years old, my child. Don't treat me as if I were 3. From below, the sound of new voices arriving in the hall indicated that more guests had entered. Someone turned on the sound system microphone for a quick test, and the click echoed through the corridor like a snap. None of the 4 paid attention to it at that moment. But later, when the consequences began to unfold, that insignificant click would prove to be the detail that changed everything. While the second-floor corridor remained closed in that tense impasse between Renata, Rodrigo, Isadora, and Donna Cecilia, the hall downstairs had apparently resumed its normalcy. The waiters were serving the second course. Some guests were talking in smaller groups that had naturally formed between the side tables, and the ambient music followed its calculated course of discreet sophistication. For anyone arriving now without having seen what had happened, it would be an ordinary night at the Vasconcelos mansion. But not everything had returned to normal. There were scattered around the room those who had seen, and among those who had seen, there were those who had done something that would completely change the course of that night. They had filmed it. Paulo Cesar, the nephew of one of Edmundo's oldest partners, was 25 years old and had the habit of documenting everything at parties like that, not out of malice, but for the same reason most people of his generation documented anything remotely interesting. When the wine glass tipped over Renata with that precision, impossible to be accidental, his phone was already in his hands. He filmed the following seconds: the stained dress, Isadora's face, Rodrigo's gesture, the words exchanged near Renata's chair, and only stopped when the 3 disappeared down the corridor. He hadn't thought much about what to do with the video immediately. He held the phone in his hand for a few moments, watched what he had recorded, and then realized he wasn't the only one. At the back table, a cousin of Rodrigo was also pointing her phone in the same direction during the incident, and near the side window, one of the company's most senior employees had made the same instinctive gesture of someone recording what the eyes cannot process fast enough. Gustavo was the first to notice this multiplicity of records. He stood up from the table, under the pretext of getting another drink at the improvised bar in the corner of the hall, and on the way, crossed eyes with Paulo Cesar, with a silent understanding that needed no words. The 2 were not close, but there was something in that moment that placed them on the same side without any verbal negotiation. The mansion's sound system had been installed 2 months earlier for that specific event, replacing the old equipment. It was a discrete system, with microphones built into the ceiling cornices of the main hall and the access corridor, designed to capture ambient audio and distribute it through the speakers without feedback. The technician responsible for the installation had checked the operation before the guests arrived, and the microphones had been active since the beginning of the night. The click the 4 had heard in the corridor was not a test. It was the system automatically processing volume peaks, as it was programmed to do. No one had turned off the corridor microphone. This information reached Gustavo through Marcos, the mansion manager, a 52-year-old man who had worked for the Vasconcelos family for nearly 2 decades and who had witnessed more than would be convenient to admit over those years. Marcos approached Gustavo with that professional discretion that was his trademark and said, in a very low voice, that the system had captured the corridor audio and that there was a complete recording of everything that had been said between Rodrigo, Isadora, Renata, and Donna Cecilia. Gustavo stood still for a second. Then he asked what had been captured. Marcos said everything, every word. Meanwhile, in the main hall, Isadora had come down alone a few minutes before Rodrigo and resumed her place at the table with a composure that bordered on insolence. She served herself more wine, resumed a conversation about the real estate market with one of Edmundo's partners, and acted as if the last 40 minutes had not existed. It was a performance of self-confidence that would work perfectly if there weren't so many people in the room who already knew what they had seen. Rodrigo's cousin, Fernanda, who had filmed the incident, was now with her phone in her bag and a closed expression that contrasted with the visible effort to maintain a normal conversation with the person sitting beside her. She had grown up with Rodrigo, had known Renata since the first presentation dinner 11 years ago, and had witnessed from the inside the progressive erosion of that marriage. She hadn't said anything for years because it wasn't her business. because the family didn't interfere, because Rodrigo was difficult and she knew it, but he was a relative. Tonight, however, what she had seen made silence harder to sustain. Rodrigo returned to the hall a few minutes later. He sat at the table, served himself water, and when someone asked him about Renata, he said she was recomposing herself and would be down shortly. He said this with that ease of someone who is convinced the situation is under control. It wasn't, but he didn't know that yet. It was Paulo Cesar who first shared the video, not publicly, but via private message to two friends who were also at the event. It was an almost reflexive gesture, the impulse to show something surprising to those who could validate the surprise. In less than 10 minutes, however, the video had left the group of guests and entered a larger chain. Someone posted it on their stories. Someone forwarded it to a local gossip profile. And then, with the specific speed of things that people instinctively recognize as true and unjust, the video began to circulate. Gustavo was alerted by a message on his cell phone. He opened the link and watched the very hall where he was sitting appear on his phone screen with the incident clear. Isadora's face identifiable, Rodrigo's words audible. He closed the phone and looked at the table for a moment. Then he stood up and went toward the corridor, where Renata still was. He went up the stairs with quick steps and found the corridor empty. Donna Cecilia had taken Renata to one of the reserved rooms at the end of the corridor, a smaller room with sofas and a window overlooking the back garden, away from the noise of the event. Gustavo knocked on the door, heard Donna Cecilia's voice say they could enter, and found the two seated, Renata with her arms crossed over the stained dress and a gaze that was far beyond easy crying, and Donna Cecilia beside her with that solid and quiet presence that only exists in people who have seen a lot and learned not to waste energy on what cannot be undone. Gustavo sat in the armchair opposite and showed the phone to Renata. She looked at the screen, watched the video without expression for a few seconds, and then just said, "How many people have seen this?" Gustavo said he didn't know for sure, but that it was spreading fast. Renata was silent for a long moment. Then she looked at the window and the dark garden outside and said more to herself than to the other two that there was a specific irony in spending years trying to protect the image of a family that had never bothered to protect hers. Donna Cecilia placed her hand on her knee and said nothing. Downstairs, the phones in the hall began to vibrate with a frequency that could no longer be ignored. The first sign that something had changed was the silence that settled among the conversation groups in the main hall. It wasn't a sudden silence. It was that silence that forms when people start looking at their own phones at the same time, and side comments die out while eyes read. One guest touched another's arm. A woman stood up from the table and walked to the bathroom with a haste that wasn't about the bathroom. One of Edmundo's oldest partners put on his glasses and stared at the screen with an expression that mixed incredulity with recognition. Isadora noticed the change before Rodrigo. She had that specific ability to feel the environment around her, an antenna developed over years of navigating environments where social approval was legal tender. Something had changed in the way people looked at her. It was too subtle to be identified immediately, but present enough to tighten something in her chest. She took her own phone discreetly, unlocked the screen, and in less than 30 seconds was looking at herself in the video that had already been forwarded to her by a person who didn't know she was at the party. She closed the phone, breathed, and then looked at Rodrigo with an expression he misinterpreted as sympathetic concern, when in fact it was the expression of someone calculating an exit. Rodrigo only noticed when Fernanda stood up from the table and went to him. She didn't sit down. She stood beside his chair, leaned in slightly, and said, in a low voice and without amenities, that there was a video circulating of what had happened tonight and that he needed to deal with it now, not later now. Rodrigo asked her to show it. Fernanda unlocked the phone and put it in front of him. He watched the video twice. The second time he paid attention to the audio. The words he had said in the hall were clear. It was sharp that he had called an accident. Something that the image showed was no accident at all. He closed the phone and returned it to Fernanda without saying anything. Isadora said in a low voice that they needed to find Renata now and talk to her before the situation went completely out of control. Rodrigo said it was under control. Isadora said, "It isn't." Marcos, the mansion manager, appeared in the hall at that moment with that professional composure that was clearly costing a considerable effort. He called Rodrigo aside with a discreet gesture, and, when the two were at some distance from the other guests, informed him about the corridor audio system. He said the microphone had captured the conversation from the upper floor, and that there was a complete recording of everything that had been said between Rodrigo, Isadora, Renata, and Donna Cecilia. Rodrigo turned white. He asked if the file existed only in the mansion's system. Marcos said there was an automatic cloud backup, standard for the new equipment. Rodrigo asked if it was possible to delete it. Marcos looked at him for a second before replying that he did not feel comfortable doing that without authorization from the property owner. Rodrigo said he was the property owner. Marcos did not respond immediately, and in that silence there was information Marcos had carried for years and that had never been his responsibility to reveal, but which made that statement of Rodrigo's much less certain than he supposed. Meanwhile, in the hall, the situation continued its silent transformation. Guests who previously maintained the posture of having seen nothing now exchanged comments in low voices, with less care than before. One of the women at the table wondered aloud, to the small group around her, if someone should call Renata to check if she was okay, and the question itself was a sign that the tacit pact of not seeing was being suspended. Gustavo had come down from the reserved room after speaking with Renata and Donna Cecilia, and now circulated through the hall with that calm presence of someone who has more information than they demonstrate. He had spoken with Marcos briefly before going up, and what he knew now was enough to understand that tonight still had much to reveal. There was the corridor recording. There were the videos circulating. There were the guests waking up to what they had chosen not to see. And there was Edmundo, the patriarch, who had been upstairs since long before all this started, and who had not yet come down. Gustavo looked at the top of the staircase for a moment. Edmundo Vasconcelos was a 71-year-old man who had built an empire from nothing, who had lost his wife 8 years earlier, and who had deposited in his daughter-in-law over the years a trust that his own son had never entirely deserved. Gustavo knew this because it had been Edmundo who 3 years earlier had told him privately that Renata was the best thing that had entered that family in a generation, and that he hoped Rodrigo had enough intelligence to realize that before it was too late. Apparently, Rodrigo had not had that intelligence. In the hall, Isadora had resumed a conversation with the forced tone of someone who is trying to normalize a situation that has already passed the point of normalization. Two of the partners present stood up at almost the same time and went toward the bathroom or the corridor, the movement of those who need a moment out of everyone's visual field to call someone or check something on their phones. The room's energy had changed in a way that could no longer be undone with ambient music or a second dessert service. Rodrigo went back up the stairs. He knocked on the door of the reserved room with 2 taps that were an order disguised as formality. From the other side, Donna Cecilia's voice said they could enter. He opened the door and found Renata standing near the window, with the dress still stained, and the old lady sitting with her hands in her lap, with the specific tranquility of someone who is no longer afraid of anything. Rodrigo told Renata that they needed to go down together and give a statement to the guests, that there was a narrative to be controlled and that she needed to cooperate. He said this as if it were reasonable, as if he were proposing a solution and not asking her to participate in a public lie. Renata looked at him for a moment and then said, with a voice that had found something new, something firm that wasn't there 11 years ago, "I'm not going to lie to anyone." Rodrigo said he wasn't asking her to lie, just to be reasonable. She said, "Reasonable is a word you use when you want me to do what you want." He was left without an answer for a second that lasted longer than he would have liked, and it was at that exact moment that the sound of slow and heavy steps began to ascend the main staircase. Edmundo Vasconcelos's steps had an unmistakable rhythm for those who had known him long enough. They were steps that were in no hurry, not because they were slow, but because they came from a man who had learned decades ago that speed did not impress as much as presence. He ascended the staircase with one hand lightly resting on the dark wood railing, wearing the same charcoal grey suit he wore on all formal family occasions, and carried in that deep-lined face the expression of someone who already knew more than they had been told. Marcos had gone up before him. not to warn but because it was his job to anticipate what the patriarch would need upon arrival, and what Edmundo would need at that moment was precise information without ornaments. The corridor fell silent when he appeared at the top of the staircase. Rodrigo was standing at the door of the reserved room. Isidora had come up behind him a few minutes earlier and positioned herself slightly behind and beside him, and Donna Cecilia had remained seated where she was, with Renata standing near the window. When Edmundo appeared in the corridor, something changed in the weight of the air. It was that type of silence that only exists when a figure of real authority, not the performative authority that Rodrigo exercised, but the authority that comes from having built something for real and having answered for one's own acts over a lifetime, enters a space. Edmundo stopped a few steps from Rodrigo and Isidora. He looked at his son first, with that slow fatherly attention that is seeing beyond the surface. Then he looked at Isidora, who held the gaze for a second before looking away. Then he looked beyond the two of them, to the reserved room where Renata stood at the back with the stained dress still visible even in the room's weaker lighting. He entered the room without saying anything. He walked to Renata with that same slowness that was not weakness, stopped in front of her, and looked at the stained dress with an attention that lasted longer than a casual observation would justify. Then he looked at her face. Renata did not look away. Edmundo said in a voice low enough so that only she and Donna Cecilia could hear, "You are okay." It wasn't a question. She replied that she was understanding a lot of things with great clarity, which was the same answer she had given to Donna Cecilia before, but in that mouth it had a different weight. Edmundo nodded slightly, as if that confirmed something he had already concluded. Then he turned his face to the corridor, where Rodrigo and Isidora were still standing. Rodrigo took a step into the room and began to speak. He used the tone he used when he needed to convince his father of something, the specific mixture of logical reasoning and effective familiarity that had worked throughout his life often enough to become a reflex. He said it had been a misunderstanding, that Isidora had tripped, that Renata had misinterpreted the situation due to pre-existing tensions in the marriage, that it could be resolved within the family without needing to involve anyone else. Edmundo heard it all. He stood absolutely still while his son spoke, without any expression that betrayed what he was thinking. When Rodrigo finished, there was a pause. Then Edmundo said, "You are lying to me." Rodrigo began to answer, but his father slightly raised one of his hands, the simple gesture of someone who does not need more volume to be heard. Edmundo said he had watched the video in the upstairs office, that he had heard the corridor audio, which Marcos had shown him before he came down, that he had seen with his own eyes Isidora's face at the moment the glass tipped, and that 71 years of life taught how to distinguish an accident from a decision, and that he had heard every word his own son had said to force his wife to submit to a public lie inside their own house. Rodrigo fell silent. Isidora, at the back of the corridor, took a small step back that no one pretended not to notice. What happened next was something that none of those present would forget. Edmundo left the reserved room toward the corridor with calm and precise steps. He stopped in front of Rodrigo, and then, with a movement that was neither impulsive nor emotional but deliberate like a sentence, he slapped his son's face. It wasn't violent, it was precise, and the silence that followed was absolute. Rodrigo stood still. His hand reflexively went to his face, and in his eyes there was a confusion that went beyond physical pain. It was the specific confusion of someone who had spent their entire life confident that certain protections would always exist, and who had just discovered that this confidence had been a mistake. Edmundo said, in a voice that was now loud enough to reach the hall below where the guests had fallen silent, "What you did tonight inside this house was not just cowardice. It was a betrayal of the only person who had enough dignity to stand by your side when you didn't deserve it." Isidora tried to say something. Edmundo looked at her, and there was something in that look so clear and definitive that her words died before coming out. Edmundo said she would need to leave the mansion before the end of the night. Isidora said she didn't understand by what right he was making that decision, that Rodrigo was the one who lived there, that it was the family's house. And it was then that Edmundo said the thing that no one in the corridor expected. He said she was mistaken regarding the matter of ownership, and that the time had come to clarify this before everyone. He asked the two of them to go down. He said there was something that needed to be said in the hall, with everyone present, without exception. Renata descended the staircase beside Donna Cecilia, with Edmundo a step ahead and Rodrigo behind in silence. Isadora came last, with a posture that still tried to project self-confidence, but had lost the internal solidity that made it convincing. Renata's stained dress was visible to everyone in the hall when she entered, and no one pretended not to look. It was impossible not to look. It was a dress that had become a symbol of something that everyone present already knew was real, but had chosen not to name until that night. The hall had fallen silent even before they reached the foot of the staircase. Gustavo was standing near the bar. With a glass in his hand he had forgotten to drink, observing the descent with that specific attention of someone who knows they are about to see something important. Fernanda had returned to the table, but was completely turned toward the staircase. Paulo Cesar had his phone in his hand, but this time he wasn't filming. He was just looking. Marcos stood discreetly near the entrance of the side corridor, with his hands together in front of his body. Edmundo walked to the center of the hall. It was a gesture that needed no announcement. When that man positioned himself like that, with that posture, everyone who knew him knew they were going to hear something that needed to be heard. He began by saying that there was something that needed to be said that night, before everyone, because circumstances made silence a form of complicity with what had happened. He said that what everyone had seen or heard regarding the incident that night was true, that Renata had been deliberately humiliated inside this house, that his son had lied to protect the one who had committed that humiliation, and that this would not be swept under the rug, with the convenience the family had learned to practice over many years. Rodrigo, standing beside the staircase, had a closed face. Isadora had stopped near the hall entrance, without advancing, as if she still wasn't sure what her place in that would be. Edmundo then said there was another matter to be dealt with, a matter of a practical and legal nature that the time had come to make public. He said that the mansion where everyone was that night, where the family had held its annual dinner for 4 decades, where Renata had worked, organized, cared for, and maintained for 11 years, did not belong to Rodrigo. The silence that followed was different from all the previous silences of that night. It was the silence of when information that reorganizes everything arrives suddenly. Edmundo said that 7 years earlier, when Rodrigo's marriage completed 4 years, and when he himself had realized that his daughter-in-law was the one who actually held that family together with competence and silence, he had decided to do something he considered fair. He had consulted his lawyers, had prepared the necessary documentation, and had legally transferred the ownership of the mansion to Renata as a late wedding gift, with the condition that this be revealed only when he deemed it necessary. He had deemed that that moment had arrived. Renata stood still. She looked at her father-in-law with an expression that could not be decoded from the outside, part shock, part recognition of something she didn't know she needed to hear. Rodrigo took 2 steps forward. He said that wasn't possible, that he had never been informed, that there were a series of legal issues that made that statement at the very least questionable. Edmundo said he had been informed, yes. There was a letter in the company office delivered personally to his son 4 years ago, detailing the transfer and the reasons behind it. If Rodrigo had not read that letter with enough attention, that was Rodrigo's problem, not a legal problem. Isadora opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. She said with a voice that had completely lost the tone of someone with firm ground under their feet, but Rodrigo said this house was the family's. Edmundo looked at her and said, "It is the family's. Renata is family. You are not." The family lawyer, Dr. Andrade, who had arrived at the event earlier and stayed discreet at the back of the hall all night, stood up at that moment. She was a woman in her 50s, with precise speech and an always controlled expression, and she had been the one responsible for the transfer documentation 7 years earlier. She confirmed to the entire hall that the property was registered in the name of Renata Vasconcelos, and that all documentation was valid, registered in a notary's office, and legally irreversible without the owner's express consent. One of the partners present said more to himself than to the others that this changed a lot. Gustavo looked at Renata from across the hall with something that could be called relief, as if a scale that had been tilted for a long time had finally found the right level. Rodrigo tried to regain some thread of control. He said that was a private family matter that did not need to be discussed that way in public, that there were legal means to contest it, that there were years of life together that needed to be taken into account. Edmundo said, "You spent the entire night trying to erase your wife inside her own house. There is nothing private about that. Everyone here saw." Isadora began to move toward the hall exit. She said nothing. She was just leaving, with that specific speed of someone who realized the ground disappeared and that the only remaining option is retreat. Marcos, without anyone needing to ask, positioned himself discreetly near the main exit. He didn't block it. He just stood visible enough for Isadora to know there was someone there and that the exit, when it happened, would be orderly. In the hall, some guests had already stood up. Others were still seated, but it was evident the night had ended the way it had begun, as an exhibition. But now, with the truth visible to everyone. Renata stood in the middle of the hall with the stained dress and her eyes scanning the faces of the people around her. She had never liked being the center of attention. She had spent 11 years becoming invisible by strategic choice and for survival. But at that moment, under that light, there was something different happening inside her. It wasn't victory yet. It was the beginning of something that didn't yet have a name, but that felt like firm ground under her feet after a long time swimming. There was a moment of suspension in the hall after everything had been revealed. One of those moments when the air seems denser, when those present need a few seconds to internally reorganize what they believed they knew about the people around them. Rodrigo was leaning against the wall near the staircase, with an expression that had completely lost the composure, built over decades of family life. Isadora was standing near the side door, apparently evaluating whether to leave immediately or if there was still some card to play. Edmundo had remained standing in the center of the hall beside Dr. Andrade, and the other guests formed that involuntary semicircle of those watching something that wasn't on the event schedule. Renata stood still for a moment, long enough for several people around to start wondering what she would do. This was the question the night had built from the beginning without anyone realizing. Not what Rodrigo would do, not what Edmundo would reveal, not what the videos would show, but what Renata would choose to do when she finally had the entire hall looking at her and the floor was hers. She took a deep breath. It wasn't a breath of someone trying to calm down. It was the breath of someone preparing to say something they had been thinking about for longer than anything that happened that specific night. She said that for 11 years she had not spoken with that voice, not the way she needed to speak. She had learned to communicate in smaller registers, in questions that didn't provoke a reaction, in agreements that preserved peace, in silences that functioned as tacit agreements with a system that benefited her with stability in exchange for visibility. She said she had thought for a long time that this was the reasonable price of a life that, on the outside, seemed to work. Some guests who had begun to move to leave stopped. There was something in her voice, not raised, not performative, but with that specific quality of someone speaking from inside something real that held attention differently than a speech. She said that the stained dress she was wearing at that moment, which she had considered changing at her husband's insistence, was the most honest symbol of that night. That there was an old and very well-trained impulse inside her to disappear, change clothes, reappear as if nothing had happened, protect the narrative that protected everyone's peace but hers. And that tonight had been the first time in a long time she had felt she could no longer do that. Not because she didn't know how, but because she had finally understood that knowing how to do something and deciding if you are going to do it are completely different questions. Gustavo, at the back of the hall, lightly rested his hand on the bar counter. There was something on his face that was hard to name. It wasn't just satisfaction at seeing the situation being corrected. It was the recognition of someone who had rooted for that woman in silence for many years, and who was seeing, for the first time, the person he had always sensed she was emerge completely to the surface. Renata looked at Edmundo then. She said she thanked him for the trust he had placed in her, that she thanked him for the gesture of years ago that she had only discovered that night, and that she understood there was a specific form of generosity in preserving that secret until the right moment. She said she didn't know if he had waited for a moment like that, or if he had imagined things would resolve in another way. But that either way, tonight, there was a clarity that neither of the two possibilities had completely anticipated. Edmundo nodded with that sobriety that was his way of expressing what other people would express with hugs or words. Renata turned her face to Rodrigo, and there, at that moment when it would be reasonable to expect accusation or recrimination, she did something that surprised everyone, including herself. She said nothing for a long moment. She looked at her husband with that attention of someone seeing someone they know too well to be deceived, but also too well to simplify. She said finally that it had been a long night, and that there would be much to be talked about, discussed and decided, and that none of that needed to happen in that hall, in front of everyone. She said there were things that belonged to private spaces, and that the problem had not been the lack of private conversations, but what had happened in public that night, which demanded a public response. Then she turned her face back to the guests. She said she understood that many there had seen what had happened, and had remained silent for reasons she knew well. That silence, in environments like that, was a form of social survival as much as hers had been, but that there was a difference between a silence that protects those who need protection and a silence that protects those who do not deserve it. And that learning to distinguish between the two was, she thought, one of the most difficult and most necessary things any person needed to do. Fernanda, at the table, wiped the corner of her eye in a way that tried to be discreet and wasn't. Paulo Cesar lowered his phone, which he had raised at some point without realizing. Dr. Andrade looked at Edmundo with a look that was almost a silent greeting. Isadora, near the door, had remained still during the entire speech. There was something on her face that was no longer pride. It was the expression of someone who had entered that room with the conviction that she knew exactly who the people around her were, and who had discovered throughout that night that her readings had been profoundly mistaken. Marcos was beside her now, not in a threatening way, but with that discreet and firm presence of someone available to accompany her to the exit when she was ready. She was ready. Isadora left through the side corridor without words. The door closed behind her with a soft sound that no one commented on, but everyone heard. In the hall, someone began to applaud. It wasn't an organized or rehearsed applause. It was an applause that began in one place and spread, because there was something in the air that needed an outlet, a collective recognition that something real had happened that night, something that wasn't theater. Rodrigo did not applaud. He stayed where he was, leaning against the wall, with the face of someone slowly understanding the extent of what he had lost, not just that night, but over many years, an accumulation of small and large choices that had arrived together at the same place. The night ended in a way none of the guests had anticipated when they arrived. The cars left one by one through the mansion entrance, but not in the discreet way of someone leaving an event early, so as not to create embarrassment. They left in a slower way, with more conversation in the groups that formed in the outside garden, with that specific quality of people who need to process something before taking it home. There was in the groups a mixture of sincere commotion, immediate analysis, and that type of reflection that only happens when something you witnessed touches something you were avoiding thinking about in your own life. Gustavo was one of the last to leave. He stayed in the garden for a while talking to Fernanda, who had truly cried at some point after Renata's speech, and who was now with that specific calm of the crying that was necessary. They talked about what had happened with that honesty that relatives sometimes find after a formal night's protocol completely collapses. Gustavo said he had waited for that moment for a long time, not the scandal, but the moment Renata finally spoke with that voice. Fernanda said she had kept the video, not because she wanted to use it as a weapon, but because there was something in the scene that seemed too important to let exist only in memory. Inside the mansion, the main hall had been partially dismantled by Marcos's team, who worked with the efficiency of those accustomed to closing events of all types. The tables were cleared, the floral arrangements collected, the glasses taken to the pantry. There was a strange quality to that space now. The mansion that for decades had functioned as a stage for prestige and appearances was exactly the same from an architectural point of view and completely different in everything else. Renata was sitting in the upper floor office, the same room where Edmundo had spent the first part of the night before coming down. It was an office with walls covered in books, an old oak desk, and 2 leather armchairs that had heard many important conversations over the years. Edmundo was sitting in the armchair opposite her, with the tiredness of a 71-year-old man who had just gone through an emotionally demanding night, but with that presence that did not diminish with tiredness. They talked for a long time. Edmundo said that that letter had been in the company file since 4 years ago, that he had left it to Rodrigo to decide what to do with that information, that there was a part of him that had hoped his son would show himself to be up to the task. Renata said she understood. She said there was a part of her that had also hoped, for different reasons, for longer than was reasonable. Edmundo said there was a difference between the hope that sustains and the hope that paralyzes, and that he had learned that difference late in his own life, and that it was one of the things he wished he had understood sooner. Renata looked at the office around her and thought she had entered that room few times in 11 years, always at Edmundo's invitation, always for matters that weren't Rodrigo's. There was a pattern in that she was only seeing now with clarity. Her father-in-law had, in his own way, created spaces for her that her husband never had. There was a specific sadness in this perception, not bitterness, but the melancholy of someone seeing a care that arrived through the wrong path and yet arrived. Rodrigo was in the couple's bedroom at the end of the corridor. He hadn't tried to speak to Renata after the guests had left. He had gone up, closed the door, and stayed there with it. There was something Renata recognized in this behavior, not as an excuse, but as a given. Rodrigo didn't know what to do when he couldn't control the narrative. He had spent his entire life operating within systems where the family name, social position, and money functioned as shock absorbers between his own actions and the consequences. That night had removed the shock absorbers, and what remained when that happened was a man who had not developed at any point in his life the emotional musculature necessary to stand on his own without them. That didn't make him less responsible. It made him more understandable, which was a very different thing from being forgiven. Dr. Andrade had stayed at the mansion later than was her habit. She and Renata exchanged brief words in the corridor before the lawyer left. Practical words about next steps, about documentation, about the implications of what had been revealed publicly. There was much to be done in the following weeks. Questions that would demand clear decisions about what Renata wanted for that house, for that marriage, for that life that had reached a crossroads without possible make-up. Renata said she needed a few days. Dr. Andrade said she had all the time she needed and that there was support when she was ready. After the lawyer left, Marcos found Renata in the corridor and handed her a copy of the audio file on a flash drive, saying she might need that eventually and that it was hers by right as the property owner. She thanked him with a brevity that carried much more than words. Marcos nodded, said goodnight, and went to finish supervising the close of the event. Outside, Gustavo was still in the garden when Renata went down there. He was alone with his hands in his pockets, looking at the lit garden. When she appeared through the side door, he looked at her for a moment and said she didn't need to say anything if she didn't want to. She said she knew. They stood there for a few minutes in silence, that silence of those who have been on the same side of a difficult thing and who don't need words to recognize it. Gustavo said eventually that she had spoken very well. She replied that she had told the truth, which was different from speaking well. He said sometimes they were the same thing. She thought about it for a moment and then said maybe they were. When he left, Renata stayed alone in the garden for some more time. She looked at the mansion illuminated from the entrance, at the wrought iron gates being closed by the team, at the garden she had personally cared for in the early years of the marriage before delegating to a landscaper. There were 11 years of life in that space, not just the difficult ones, but the others too. The early years when she had still believed things could be different, when she had planted the rose bushes on the right side of the garden because she had read that hardy roses need well-drained soil and had liked the metaphor. The rose bushes were still there. She looked at them for a long moment. Then she went back inside the house, closed the door behind her, and began to ascend the staircase into the night. 3 weeks after that October night, the Morumbi mansion woke up with a different light. It was Saturday morning, a partially cloudy sky with that type of diffuse clarity that São Paulo has on days when the city decides to breathe. And Renata was in the back garden with a cup of coffee in her hands, sitting on the stone bench between the rose bushes and the small fountain that had been installed 2 years earlier at the landscaper's suggestion. Much had happened in those 3 weeks. Rodrigo had moved to an apartment in Itaim Bibi that belonged to the company, an apartment that was in his individual name, and that had been discreetly prepared in the days following that night, as if he had planned that exit, or as if the time had come for an exit that had been postponed longer than the dinner night. The conversations between them had been few, conducted through Dr. Andrade for the most part, with that specific formality that is sometimes more honest than any amount of unstructured emotional dialogue. The company board had indeed met, as had been mentioned that night by Rodrigo himself, at a moment when he still tried to demonstrate he controlled the consequences. The video had arrived before the board formally called the meeting, and there were board members who had relations with the family for decades and who had also seen it. Rodrigo had been temporarily removed from executive functions while a conduct evaluation was underway. It was the type of process that had its own rhythm and that no one, including Edmundo, had tried to accelerate or slow down. Isadora had disappeared from the sphere of public visibility as completely as someone could, who had done nothing illegal, only something everyone had seen, and no one was willing to pretend not to have seen. Her contract with the company had been terminated by mutual agreement, a euphemism that carried fewer details than the real situation, but had the advantage of legal precision. Renata had received a series of messages in the days following the dinner, from guests who had remained silent during the night, and who felt afterward that the silence had weighed in ways that needed to be named. There were short messages of apology for what had not been said. There were longer messages from people who used her situation as a mirror to talk about something in their own lives. There were messages from Fernanda, who had actually called to ask how she was, and who had said with that uncomfortable honesty that was her trademark, that she had kept the regret of not having spoken sooner for longer than she should have. Renata had responded to each of them, not with exuberance or accusation, but with that thoughtful brevity of someone starting to learn how to receive care without immediately minimizing it. Donna Cecilia had visited the mansion the following week. She had stayed for 2 hours, drunk tea in the same reserved room where they had sat that night, and talked about a series of things that had no direct relation to what had happened, family stories from decades ago, observations about the garden, an orange cake recipe she said was the best in the city. At the end, before leaving, she had only said that there was something in the way Renata had spoken that night that had reminded her of her own mother. She didn't explain what was in the memory, but there was something in the comparison that Renata carried very carefully in the following days. Edmundo had been to the mansion twice. He was a man who didn't need more words than he had said that night, and the two had found a more honest, simpler rhythm of coexistence than what had existed in the previous 11 years when Rodrigo was the axis around which everything had to revolve. There was something of relief in that new rhythm. Gustavo had sent a short message 3 days after the dinner. It said only that he had been thinking about what she had said, about the difference between silence that protects and silence that doesn't protect, and that it was a distinction he intended to apply more carefully from then on. Renata had responded with a short text that ended in an invitation to have coffee at some point, without urgency, without weight, just because there was something in that friendship that deserved more space than the marriage structure had allowed. Sitting in the garden that Saturday morning, Renata looked at the rose bushes she had planted years before and thought there was something particular about taking care of plants. It was a care that didn't ask for recognition. It was a care that happened in the absence of an audience, without anyone needing to see for the results to exist. The rose bushes had grown anyway, regardless of who had paid attention to them or not. She had spent 11 years functioning in a similar way, taking care of things that mattered regardless of any validation. There was value in that. There was also a cost. And what that October night had done, with all its specific violence of things that only happen when accumulated pressure finds the exact point of rupture, was to make that cost visible to herself in a way that could no longer be ignored. She didn't know what life would be like in the months ahead. There were many decisions to be made, about the mansion, about what to do with that space, about what kind of presence she wanted to have in the family business, about the kind of life she had postponed building in the name of a peace that had revealed itself to be very expensive. There was uncertainty in that, and uncertainty was something she had been trained, by the life she had chosen, to avoid at all costs. But there was also something new, an openness that wasn't naivety. It was the feeling that the territory ahead, however undefined it might be, was hers to travel in the way she chose, and that this choice, finally, was genuinely hers. The coffee cup was almost cold when she finally stood up from the stone bench and went toward the back door of the mansion. She stopped for a moment with her hand on the handle, looked one last time at the garden, at the rose bushes that were blooming exactly the way flowers bloom when someone cares for them with attention, and went in. End of story. Dear listeners, if Renata's story touched something inside you, if you recognized in her the courage of someone who finally finds their own voice after much silence, then you know that some stories deserve to be followed until the end. We have prepared a special selection of narratives with the same care and the same intensity, ready for you to explore right now. If this video was part of your night or your day, leave your like so that more people can find this channel. Subscribe so you don't miss what's to come, and tell us in the comments which moment of this story stayed with you the most. We read every word. Until the next story.